Obviously, last week we were talking about the Florida project and how Walt Disney bought all the land that Walt Disney World is on now. And today we are going to be talking about the windows down Main Street, which kind of marries up quite nicely and follows on from the last video. Because in the last video we were talking about how Walt Disney created a lot of shell or fake companies to buy the land for Walt Disney World, just to keep suspicions low and make sure that the media wasn't talking about him or his company until he was ready, and also kept the land prices down as well because the owners didn't know who they were selling to. And actually all these shell companies are displayed in the windows down Main Street, kind of to mark that they were a really important part of the process of building Magic Kingdom, and it just makes it a really fun Easter egg for people as well. If you are a Disney nerd, it's always nice to walk down Main Street and kind of point out that window and tell your group that you're with exactly what that means. And I just think it's a really nice idea. Obviously, there are so many windows down Main Street. That is only one of them, which we spoke about in last week's episode, but there are so many different windows, so many different main streets as well across the world, and I just thought they deserved their whole own episode. I think this even might be a series in itself because I've only really scraped the surface with the history of it so far. There are so many to talk about, so many important people that are mentioned on the windows down Main Street. So yeah, let's get straight into it. So like I did in last week's video, I actually do want to give a little brief overview of Main Street and the windows. Just in case you've never been to Disney World before, I want this podcast to be a really enjoyable experience for lots of different people, whether you've been on 1 trip, 10 trips, 50 trips, 100 trips, whether you're an annual pass holder, whether you really want to go out there and you've never been before. I want to make sure everyone has a little piece of knowledge and understanding to take away with them. So basically, Main Street is the first section of land that you walk into when you go into basically any of the Disney parks. Magic Kingdom, obviously in Florida, Disneyland California, Disneyland Paris, and then Shanghai and Tokyo also have their own versions of Main Street. It's not exactly called Main Street, but it's a very similar vibe and it does have windows as well. So you've probably seen tons of photos of it. Obviously at the end of Main Street there is usually the castle there looking beautiful, and it is basically just this really long street that has townhouses and shops all down it, and you can walk through them, you can walk into them. They're all working stores or places within their own right. There's lots you can do around Main Street. I think it's quite underrated actually because people normally just go straight to the castle and then to all the other lands around the Disney parks, but it is a really, really special place, and obviously the first thing that you see when you're walking into the Magic. So Main Street was created from the very beginning in Walt Disney's first park in California, and it was actually created to resemble Walt's memories from his childhood. So he lived in the turn of the 20th century in an American town, and Main Street is meant to replicate that, which is honestly insane. I know Main Street is very beautiful and picturesque. Obviously it's very clean and tidy. I can't imagine that Walt's real life town was exactly like that, but it's lovely to know that this actually does have a bit of history behind it, and when Walt was creating it he was actually pulling information from a really core memory in his mind. So I just think that's really cool. Obviously it was first built in Disneyland California, and then it moved over to Magic Kingdom. It's almost an exact replica in Magic Kingdom, following that very same traditional turn of the century style, and then it went to Disneyland Paris. Again, it looks very, very similar in Paris, and then when it went over to Shanghai and Tokyo it did start to tweak a little bit, but you can still very much tell when you're there that it's meant to be their version of Main Street USA. So while we're on talking about kind of the heritage and the era that Main Street is based around, I wanted to throw in a little bit of a fun fact. So obviously, like I said, Main Street USA was based around the turn of the 20th century of Walt Disney's hometown, and the Grand Floridian is actually meant to be this very same era, but whereas Main Street USA is meant to be kind of your hometown, what you see every single day, the Grand Floridian was meant to be more of this luxurious experience where people would go on one-off holidays, or you would see more wealthy people go, because obviously it is a lot more eccentric and posh when you walk into the Grand Floridian. Still very beautiful. Main Street is still very beautiful as well, but I just found that interesting that Walt was basing both of these places off the same time period, but for sort of different amounts of wealth and comfort, which is really, really interesting. I couldn't quite find the time or the source where he said this, but Walt did actually talk a little bit more about why he wanted to create these lands in these eras. Obviously at the time when Disneyland California was created, Walt's childhood wasn't that far in the past, whereas now 50 years later, it's a lot longer ago, the turn of the century, obviously. So in Walt Disney's speech, he said, For those of us who remember the carefree times it recreates, Main Street will bring back happy memories. For younger visitors, it is an adventure in turning back the calendar to the days of their grandfather's youth, which I just think is so, so lovely. Obviously, I think he's speaking through his own sort of perspective of it. He's obviously within that more like grandfather era when he's giving this speech and saying that it's going to be really sentimental for obviously older people visiting the park, but equally for younger people, it's able to give them a step back in time, and you can show them kind of how you grew up, where you grew up, what it was like when you grew up, which is just a very special memory. And although we can't quite have that same level of appreciation for it now, obviously there's not a lot of people around nowadays that was in that sort of era. It's really lovely to think that when Disneyland was first created, that was kind of the incentive and motive, to kind of be a real life, like turn back in time, like he said, for families of all ages to go, and you can offer some advice or some history to your family and really kind of live in that moment, which I just think is so special. It's so cool, and it will be interesting to see if they do something like that in the future of Disney parks. Obviously have something that's more retro for our age range, so maybe do it in the 80s or 70s or 60s, so when grandparents go with their young children, they can take them back in time, like they say, and show them what life was like when they lived it in their youth, which is honestly just such a fun idea. I really do wonder whether they will do this again, because I think it's really cool and just such a sweet way to bring families together in the park, which is what Walt always wanted.